You're listening to the Two Tongues Podcast. And now your hosts, Kyle and Chris.
Welcome back, one and all, children of all ages, to the Two Tongues Podcast, where today we're going to do a bit of opinion scholarship, what we do best here, guys. I felt like I gave the last solo episode short shrift. If you guys remember, I did an episode called A Vaster Reality, and I was talking mostly about an interesting book by Federico Fajon called Irreducible. But I said that I had intended on speaking not just to that book, but another book called The God Theory by Bernard Haisch, because both of those people are credentialed scientists, the kind of people that aren't easy to dismiss by your rank and file atheist, I suppose, who would push back against a lot of the kind of spiritual things that we talk about here on the Two Tongue Show. It really was, by the time I was done with that episode, I thought we didn't really talk much about the God theory. And there's a bunch to talk about, so that's what I want to do today. I want to get into that rather than just ignoring it altogether. I think there's some good stuff to be said there. Bernard Haisch, for you guys who may not know, he's in like an astrophysicist type of a fella. His background is something like this. He went to school at the University of Wisconsin. He has been an astronomer for like 30 years, written all sorts of papers, scientific papers. Many of them were published in prestigious journals like Science and Nature. He also served as the editor of the Journal of Scientific Exploration and the Astrophysical Journal, won a whole bunch of NASA contracts, worked for Lockheed Martin's Palo Alto Research Lab. When he was there, he was working on classified spy satellite programs. Then he went on to work for NASA's Space Science Laboratory. So we're talking about, like Bernard Haisch, like Fajon, who we talked about last time, who's a OG computer scientist. Here we have a credentialed astronomer type of guy. Been doing it his whole life. Working for NASA. I can go on and on. But I say all of this because both Haisch and Fajon talk about things that border on the spiritual. There's all that quantum woo-woo that comes up that many people will dismiss just out of hand immediately. And I think it's more difficult to do with people like Haisch and Fajon because of their background. These are people who are, like I said, among the best of the best scientists in the world, and when they say things like the things I say, it's so much more difficult to dismiss them. And so I like this idea of science embracing spirituality and vice versa. I feel like there's something missing from the scientific pursuit, and it's like burying our head in the sand. We've talked about this ad nauseum in terms of, consciousness as an example, kind of a weird, numinous, non-physical, if not spiritual type of phenomenon. Science is like, maybe it doesn't exist, or it just is a byproduct of what happens when your brain works. It's like, okay, I don't know about that. So anyway, where I'd like to begin here is the first section, which I'm going to call What Existed Before Existence. Haisch kind of begins like this. He says the modern scientific notion of the origin of universes as a result of quantum laws depends upon the pre-existence of those laws or fields. All right, so he's saying something strictly from a physics perspective. He's saying that what physics tells you is that the universe emerged from whatever these initial conditions were in the cosmos, in the singularity, in the Big Bang, and whatever the laws that govern that singularity as it unfolded, that's what created the cosmos the way it is. So before the cosmos was created or unfolded, however you want to put it, there must have been laws pre-existing. There must have been something pre-existing. And he does say laws and also fields, so he's making a reference there to the quantum fields, or maybe even the quantum information that we heard from Fajon. So the laws that govern the physical world, he's saying, existed before the physical world. right? So there's something that pre-exists, or maybe is eternal. If something is eternal, like it just has no beginning and no end, it just is, then it's foundational. It's fundamental. It's what everything is built on. It's the one thing that can't be done away with, something like that. Something pre-exists, even in physics. So that's a little bit of a strange thing. I mean, even when you hear people like Neil deGrasse Tyson talk about this, it's maddening. And other physicists will say, look, there's really no reason to talk about what happened before the Big Bang. And they'll say weird things to you, like, that question doesn't even make sense, what happened before the Big Bang. And maybe in some ways, like in a spatial temporal perspective, maybe that's true. Maybe there wasn't space and time, so how could there be a moment before? But there still must be something. There had to be something, right? All things don't come from no place. There had to be something there that pre-exists. And that borders on a religious idea. The pre-existent, that which was before anything was. Like, how can you not think about God in that context? And then what Haisch is going to do, and you'll see this as we go on, he's just going to continue to give like scientific points, and then what he refers to as these esoteric counterpoints, these parallels or things that go along with the scientific statement. And in most cases, the esoteric version vastly predates the scientific discovery. So we're going to go back and forth in this way. So let's just push through. He says, if we are nothing but physical beings originating by chance in a random universe, then there really can be no ultimate purpose in our lives. I propose a theory that does provide a purpose for our lives, while at the same time being completely consistent with everything we have discovered about the universe. The single difference between the theory I propose and the ideas current in modern astrophysics is that I assume an infinite conscious intelligence pre-exists. All right, so we're sticking to this theme of the pre-existent. So he's saying that science, modern physics and science is going to say there's something like physical laws or fields, quantum fields or fields of potential or whatever, electromagnetic fields, something that exists before the universe unfolds. Something there before there's anything. And then what Haisch is saying now is, he proposes that thing is consciousness, an infinite conscious intelligence. Okay. Not an unheard of idea. This is something that, we'll get into a little bit, but it's something that comes up, and we talked about it with Fasion's book, Irreducible. It comes up with idealist philosophers and panpsychist philosophers. This idea that consciousness is fundamental is not new by any stretch. So again, what Haisch is saying is whatever this something is that's responsible for these pre-existent laws of physics, he says this is an infinite consciousness, and by that he means God. Okay, so he's defining God as an infinite conscious intelligence. Okay, I don't think that's a far stretch for religious people to nod their heads to. But I do want to point out that he's making an equivalency between these pre-existing quantum fields or quantum laws and God. And he doesn't go so far as saying that they're identical. I'll say that for a minute, but he can't really get around this idea that he's making some kind of equivalency here. Like how could it be, or how is it that some disembodied, infinite consciousness is or is responsible for somehow the laws of physics? Okay. All right, he goes on. He says, esoteric traditions tell us that before any beginning, there was God, the unmanifest. And that God simply is, he says. God, the unmanifest, simply is. Period. He says, God, the unmanifest, is less than nothing, and at the same time, more than everything. God, the unmanifest, does not exist in space or time. It creates space and time, and is therefore beyond them. This God is not merely immortal, but infinite. This God simply is. Now, he's going to say this throughout the book, but he makes a point. When he says simply is, he's making a claim of something being fundamental. or irreducible, as Vespasian would put it. God simply is. That's being itself, you might say. And when he says God, the unmanifest, simply is, period, he's very clearly now saying God is this pre-existence, or this pre-existing thing that he's talking about. This foundational, primordial thing. And he says something interesting next. He says God, the unmanifest, is less than nothing. Why is he less than nothing? Because it isn't real in the way the cosmos is real. Because he says God, the unmanifest. So he's talking about God before he manifests either as a being or as the cosmos. It's not really clear what Haisch believes in that regard. But before God is manifest, he's not physically real. He may be realer than real, but he's not physically real. So, but to say God, the unmanifest, is less than nothing is saying that it's not physically real or present. And at the same time, more than everything. Why? Because all things come from it. All things come from God. So it's the thing that isn't physically real that all the physically real things come from. Okay, and I want you to understand that that is a description of some kind of a paradox. And it's clear enough when he says God is less than nothing and more than everything. Paradox. Man, how can something be nothing and everything? Now, if you've been a listener to this show for a while, you've heard my explanation for that. I do have a way of making sense of that, but I do want to just point out that there's this paradoxical description of God. And this is common in mystical tradition, in the esoteric tradition, as he likes to say. Very, very common. Imagine the yin and yang from Taoist China. I mean, that is the embodiment of a paradox, something that is both white and black, right? Something that is both this and that, something that is both being and non-being. It's always a paradox, and we see it in our most ancient religious traditions absolutely everywhere, and we see it here from Haisch. So God is this pre-existing, fundamental, irreducible thing. And it's synonymous with consciousness somehow. We've already kind of been there. He goes on, he says, I am proposing that consciousness is the origin of matter, energy, and the laws of nature. And the purpose is for God to experience his potential. God experiences the richness of his potential through us because we are the incarnations of him in the physical realm. What greater purpose could there be for each of us humans than of creating God's experience? Whew, buddy, that last one got me. Hair standing up on my arms. Okay, so again, when he says, I am proposing that consciousness is the origin of matter, energy, and the laws of nature, again, you see this conflation between God and consciousness. He's just kind of going back and forth. And he's saying the purpose of existence, of physical existence, is for God to experience his potential. Now, Haisch sees God as potential or potentiality, and it's the same way that I've talked about it from my own mystical experience, almost in identical language, and there's a lot of that in this paragraph. The purpose is for God to experience his potential. What he really means by this, and I think a better way of saying this, and I don't know if Haisch would disagree, but here's my thought here. For God to experience his potential, if God is potential, which Haisch believes that's what God is, I mean, that's a definition, a working definition, then the purpose of existence is for God to experience itself, okay? God's self-experience. That is the world of matter. That is the physical cosmos. That is, you and me and everything else. God experiencing itself. He says God experiences the richness of his potential. God experiences himself through us. Why? Because we are the incarnations of him in this physical realm. Okay, that's also very interesting. It's a very Gnostic sort of sounding thing to say, because what it says is something that's very, it's very familiar to a Christian. As an example, we would say Jesus is the incarnation of God on earth, right? That's what he said here. We are the incarnations of God in the physical realm. But what Haisch does that the Bible doesn't do is Haisch extends this idea to all things, all living things, or maybe all things completely, not just the Christ, right? Every one of us is the incarnation of God. Okay, this is something I believe. This is something that that was revealed to me, you might say, in my own mystical experience. It's something that makes me see the truth in Christian dogma that I was reluctant to accept as a younger man. The idea that God would come to earth as an individual, as a unique individual human being, only once, seemed like a tall order for me to accept. When I had my own mystical experience, I had this one with the universe, one with the cosmos, one with God, apotheosis type of experience. I realized, okay, the consciousness that I am is all things. It is the thing I mean when I say God. Okay, that makes me and you an incarnation of God in the same way that Christ was. So again, that's a blasphemous way of putting it. I totally get it. But this is what I've come to believe personally, and it's something that I think gives credence to the Bible, to the story of the Gospels, let's say, that is far more mystical. In fact, there's a way that Charles Darwin said this that I think is really good. He was talking about evolution, not about the figure of Christ, but he said something about like looking at how evolution works, seeing how it works, coming to understand how it works. To Darwin's mind is a better understanding of how it's a more accurate understanding of how God works in the world than just saying, poof, beings are created instantly. This whole graceful, process unfolding over time with all these forces, like all of this intricacy and fate involved with the end result, the teleology of each species coming to be, and all of that. He said that's more in line with how I think God works than what you read in the Bible. Okay, I'm saying something similar here. I think that the Christian message, makes so much sense when we think about it this way, rather than the orthodox way that the Christians say, only Jesus Christ was the God-man. Only he was the incarnation of God. The mystical experience told me that consciousness and life itself, as a prime example, are the sacred thing, are the divine itself. And that makes each and every one of us what the Bible claims that Jesus was. Now, I'm going to leave that there. I'll let you stew on that. But even the way he ends this, when he says, what greater purpose could there be for each of us humans than of creating God's experience? And again, it reminds me of something I said after my own mystical experience, and I've said it many, many times on this podcast. Listen to how similar it is to what Haisch just said. My sort of tagline, if you will, is, we are the experience God is having. That was the revelation I received in my own mystical experience. We are the experience God is having. And Haisch says, what greater purpose could there be for humans than of creating God's experience? See, Haisch understands. His understanding is not identical to mine, but so close. And this is very common in mystical thinkers. It's more common for mystics to have a cohesive theology than it is for any individual religion, let alone trying to reconcile religions with one another. You can take every different Christian sect you want. They're going to argue about things all day long. But you take a Christian mystic and a Sufi mystic and a Taoist and you put them together, they're going to, and somebody who practices Vedanta Hinduism, they're going to be nodding their heads at each other. Like, we just have a different language here. See, and this is what I think is happening with myself and Haisch. Okay. He says, if I am correct, we are literally all one being in many individual forms. That's worth rereading. He said, if I'm correct, we are literally all one being and many individual forms. This is another message from mystical experience. Very, very common takeaway from a religious experience. We're all one, I believe. This is where monotheism comes from. This is the origin of monotheism, is this mystical experience of divine unity, of oneness. And this is what he's saying. If he's correct in his proposal here, we're all one being living individual, different lives. He says we are quite literally one with God, and God is quite literally one with us. Again, if you think, as a Christian, let's say, if you think that might be bordering on the taboo or what have you, I have to remind you that the 17th chapter of John says something very like this from the words of Jesus Christ, right? He says, as he's praying to God, that he wishes they will all be one as thou, Father, art in me and I in thee, that they may also be one in us. So Jesus is hoping, wishing, asking God that everyone can be one with God the way he is one with God. And what is Haisch saying? We are quite literally one with God, and God is quite literally one with us. You see my point? All right, he gives us a little thought experiment that he wants us to try to visualize or consider, and it goes something like this. He says, try to imagine the existence of an unlimited conscious being of infinite ability, existing outside of space and time. The ideas of this being become our laws of physics and dimensions of space and time. The manifestations of this infinite consciousness are none other than all of us and all the things we perceive around us. We are the creating intelligence made manifest, sons and daughters of that infinite consciousness. In some literal sense, we actually make our own universe and then enter into it. In this way, the Creator gets to experience its infinite potential through each of the billions of individual lives. Isn't that interesting? So in some literal way, we create our own universe and enter into it. Well, if you believe what Haisch just suggested, that we are all one with God, God, of course, does create the universe. That's what God does. That's what God is. And if we are that thing, we are living in this universe that we created in a world of our own imagining. And this is the idea here. It has to do with a mind, okay? And he says critically in the beginning here that if you imagine this infinite, unlimited conscious being, again, remember, this is a pre-physical thing. Like this is a being, but not there's not yet a physical creation. So you have to imagine, like, what can a God do if it has no body and it has no thing to do anything with, and it has no place for it to go or to do anything, right? There's no thing apart from itself. There's no place apart from itself. What can it do? That God seems pretty impotent. Like, what can it do? But you see, it's a conscious being. That's a non-physical thing, isn't it? Consciousness. So what can consciousness do in the absence of a physical body or space or time? Well, it can think. It can know. And this is what he says. He says the ideas of this being become the laws of physics and the dimensions of space and time. Right? So it has to do with mind. The mind of God. That's this pre-existing thing. And its ideas become the laws of physics and the dimensions of space and time. Now, I don't know how weird that sounds to you, but it's actually very common and ancient religious thinking. That God is mind. It's very common in the ancient Greeks, especially the pre-Socratics, people like Pythagoras and Parmenides and some of these people. But it's not just in the West, but even in the New World. You guys may remember I did this episode on the Lakota Sioux, the tribe here in the U.S. And one of the things that they say foundationally in their religion is, in the beginning, all things came from the mind of Wakonde. Right? Wakonde is their god, the Great Spirit, right? In the beginning, all things came from the mind of God. Okay, now we can look at the Greeks. We can look at Pindar. This is about 470 BC. And Pindar said, all things come from the mind of Zeus. I mean, like word for word identical, right? And then there's Anaxagoras about 500 BC who says, all things that are now or will be, Nous arranged them all. Okay, Nous is this idea of a divine mind, the mind of the cosmos, the mind of God. All things that are now or ever will be come from Nous. Right, this is not a new idea. It is not a strange idea. It's been a part of Western thought and all over the world, apparently, from very, very early times. Then he says the manifestation of this infinite consciousness are none other than us and the things we perceive around us. And again, he makes this maybe blasphemous statement, you might say, but one I agree with. We are the creating intelligence made manifest. Stated differently, we are God made manifest. But then he says something a little poetic. He says, sons and daughters of that infinite consciousness. Like we're all sons and daughters of that infinite consciousness. Why does that sound familiar to me? Well, the Bible says something much like this in Psalm 82. Psalm 82 says, you are all children of the Most High. Right? All of us. You are all children of God. Okay, moving on. He said, according to the esoteric tradition, thought is the first level of creation. For all the same reasons I said earlier. Non-physical being, all that it can do is just to think and to know. So thinking becomes the first act of creation. Makes a lot of sense, okay? He says, in a way, we do not yet understand scientifically. Thought is energy in its purest form. The universe first existed as a pure divine thought, and this thought gave birth to the physical universe, presumably through an event like the Big Bang. All right, so again, he's talking about the esoteric tradition. He says thought is the first level of creation. And then he says, in a way we don't quite understand, thought is energy in its purest form. I don't know what you might think of that, thought as energy in its purest form. But if the source of energy is mind, then clearly thought is energy in its purest form. But the ancient Greeks had an idea very like this idea of nous we just talked about a minute ago. Nous is not only thought of as mind, but also as the principle of motion. So mind and motion are integrally connected. And what does motion do? Motion brings things together, right? And what does that do? When things get brought together, they can experience one another. So motion creates experience. It also creates action. All the things that are necessary in the world, right? The world requires action in order to be a world. He says the logical consequences of the God theory lead us to some inevitable corollaries. One is, a life is God made manifest. The purpose of life is experience. Experience is how the infinite mind actualizes its infinite potential. And consciousness can be transformed, but it can never die. Right? If consciousness is God or somehow linked to God in a fundamental way, of course, it can be transformed, but it can never die. And we know that about energy. I mean, the Newtonian laws. Energy cannot be created or destroyed, but only change from one form to another. So he's saying life is God made manifest. The purpose of life is to experience, and experience is how, listen, this is critical. Experience is how the infinite mind actualizes its infinite potential. But remember, what Haisch means when he says potential is really God. So you could read that and say, experience is how the infinite mind actualizes God, how God actualizes itself. And what that means is made real, made physically real in being. So God goes from this spiritual plane that, Phasian linked to the quantum realm, this spiritual plane, numinous plane, quantum plane, into the physical world. And it does that by incarnation, right? Creates the things in which it can enter in. And even the Bible talks about this, the body being the temple, right? The temple is the place where God enters in. That brings me to my next section, which I'm going to call Explaining Creation. He says, the esoteric traditions tell us that creation by subtraction is one of the fundamental truths underlying reality. These traditions teach that creation of the real, of the manifest, involves subtraction from infinite potential. By limiting the infinitely possible, you create the finitely real. A virtual reality is thus created out of formless possibility. Now, this last bit strikes me in a strange way because he's saying that a virtual reality is created out of formless potential, which implies that our physical reality is somehow virtual and not real in the way God is real. And I think that's probably true in some way. But there's also a parallel to this idea in quantum mechanics that's well attested to. The idea that you can create a virtual something out of a nothing. And the nothing I'm talking about here is the quantum vacuum. So what physicists will say is, if you take a volume of space and you remove everything from it, you create a vacuum that you're never able to empty that vacuum, because somehow behind the vacuum, somehow behind reality, there's something happening in the quantum world that is generating is a 0-point field. It's generating this quantum energy. And what happens is, in this empty vacuum that you've created, you sit there and watch it, and you will witness particles popping in and out of existence. They call them virtual particles. And they're extremely important in the existence of the physical cosmos as a whole. And we'll get into that in a minute. It's critically important. This quantum energy, this vacuum energy, rather, as they call it, or 0-point energy. All right, so he begins by talking about creation as a process of subtraction, which I find interesting and also paradoxical. So notice how paradoxical that is. Creation by subtraction. Again, I'm going to disagree with Haisch on vocabulary. I don't think he means subtraction. I think he means separation or division rather than subtraction. But same, I suppose. And he says this idea of creation by subtraction is one of the fundamental truths of reality. I just want you to notice that that's a paradox. Okay, fair enough. I think that's enough. So we can push on to the next piece. He says, according to esoteric traditions, a desire arises in the unmanifest God to experience itself. The unmanifest God thus transforms into God made manifest. Out of the realm of the absolute, a realm of the relative is created. The realm of the relative is a realm of polarity, which makes experience possible. So polarity is just, he describes it as a this versus that experience. Polarity is, again, if you can imagine this idea of God as the only thing, God as the unity, the oneness, and he split it into two. See, now you have created the opportunity for experience. Now God can experience itself, because it's not just one thing, but now it's two, now it's many. So this polarity is what makes experience possible. And this is what he says the whole purpose of existence is, experience. Now, I do want to disagree with one thing here. In the beginning, when he says that a desire arises in the unmanifest God to experience itself, and so he transforms into the God made manifest, I don't know if it's fair to attribute something like desire to God. It seems wrong to me. So I don't think that there was a desire arising in God to experience itself. I think that God and experience are more closely related than that. It's not like subject and object, like God doing an action. It's like God and the action are one thing. To experience is God, right? Consciousness is God. It's not like something God does. So I don't think that there was a desire arising in God. I don't think that this was a temporal thing. It's like God's like, wouldn't it be nice if I could experience myself and then, flipped a switch and here's the Big Bang? I don't think that. I think that there's a process that's eternal going on. I don't think there's a beginning to it. I don't think it has to do with something like a human desire, but maybe there's a poetic way of understanding that that's over my head. And as he goes on, then he says that the unmanifest God transforms into the manifest God. It's not clear what Haisch believes, if he thinks that God is manifest in the physical world as a being, or if he's saying that the physical world is God made manifest, which I think is probably what he means, and I think what I would be more sympathetic to. But there's this interesting thing that he's doing here, which if you're not familiar with Hinduism, you might not know. When he says God, the unmanifest God and the manifest God, these are ideas that exist in Hinduism. And in Hinduism, they call it Nirguna Brahman, which is God without attributes, and Saguna Brahman, which is God with attributes. And Nirguna Brahman is the idea of this fundamental background of consciousness, this fundamental self that is behind all things. It's the divine unity. It's the cosmic oneness. It has no polarity. So it has, it's completely self-satisfactory and self-sufficient, doesn't need anything. That's why I mean, like, the idea that it would have a desire is strange. And then Saguna Brahman is the idea of God made manifest and becoming all the things that have attributes, all the things that can be named. And this is easy enough to imagine, right? If you take all the things that exist in the world, all the people and the things, and you roll them up and combine them into one thing, what we can all agree on is we no longer have all the individual things that we once had, because they're all merged now into one thing. This one thing is not what it once was. It's something new. It's this oneness. So that's God without attributes. And you could say that might also be God with all attributes, and that is the way that I understand nothing and everything being synonymous. So I brought that up earlier in the conversation, this idea of God creating from nothing. Well, if you understand nothing to be everything, if you understand those things to be equivalent, then I can go with you here. Like, if you take all the attributes and you put them together, you have no attributes. If you take all the, I don't want to beat this analogy up, but you get the idea. So he's talking about Nirguna Brahman and Saguna Brahman. He's talking about these Hindu ideas, these very mystical ideas that go right along with all the philosophy and stuff that he's giving us and will continue to give us. So while we're talking about polarity, he says, polarity is also essential to the creation of particles in physics. So we see he's giving us the esoteric, and now he's giving us kind of this analogy to the physical world. He says a photon can spontaneously transform into two particles. For instance, a positron and an electron are created by the annihilation of a gamma ray photon. Since charge is a conserved quantity, a photon with a zero charge must create particles in pairs whose charges cancel each other out. So the electron's negative charge and the positron's positive charge do this. He says nature is capable of creating charges out of pure uncharged energy. Notice that's a paradox again. Nature is capable of creating charges out of no charge. This may be the manifestation in the physical realm of a key metaphysical law of creation, he says. I once gave this analogy in a different podcast. I was talking about maybe those virtual particles, but I said, imagine you have a dollar bill in your hands. You know you don't have one, but just imagine you do. This is an imaginary dollar bill. And you pretend that you tear it in two, and you put those halves in your hands. And then you slowly open up your hands, and you have 50 cents in each hand, that real coin sitting in your hands. This is what he's talking about. You can take a nothing and you can split it into something. You can take something that isn't physically real and you can divide it into things that are real, that are physically real. This, just like we saw with the positron and electron, this is, he says, a key metaphysical law of creation. So imagine God being that uncharged thing, and we divide it, we split it, and we have all these real things now. So this is sort of the analogy. This is the parallel. And you might write off the esoteric one like, yeah, okay, that's all weird speculation and, it is what it is. But what he's saying is, yes, and the laws of physics are a mirror of this. So if these esoteric mystics forever have been saying this, and now we come to the point where, where quantum physics is also saying this, we have to wonder, is this a weird coincidence? Or did these ancient people know something? Do they have some revelation that is now being proved true through these physical laws, or has a mirror, this sort of fractal mirror in the physical world? He says, if you think of white light as a metaphor of infinite formless potential, so that's a metaphor for God. If you think of white light as a metaphor of infinite formless potential, the colors on a frame of film become a structured reality that comes about through subtraction from that formless potential. Right? So you've got this white light, but with the right filter, it's going to reveal all these different colors in the film, right? All of the colors are there in the white light that seems to have no color. Right? These charged particles are there in this uncharged photon that seems to have no charge at all. You see what I mean? He says, it results from the limitation of the unlimited. Right? He says, I contend that this metaphor provides a comprehensive theory for the creation of a manifest reality from the selective limitation of infinite potential, or just stated differently, God. He says, I contend this metaphor provides a comprehensive theory for the creation of a manifest reality from the selective limitation of God. He says, the process of creation is the exact opposite of making something out of nothing. It is, on the contrary, a filtering process that makes something out of everything. Something discrete or specific out of everything, which is something like out of the undifferentiated, right? Out of that potential he talked about. So if God is consciousness, or associated with consciousness in some very close way, we can't separate them, and God is unlimited, creation comes about by limiting that unlimited thing. And what this brings to my mind is a philosopher named Henri Bergson, who talked all about consciousness. And he proposed that what consciousness is a reducing valve. This is what he called it, right? This is the filter, right? Imagine consciousness as the filter. Imagine consciousness as the thing that allows you to see God, the infinite thing, in this multiplicity, in this divided, discrete multiplicity of physical reality. Something like that is what he's saying. God is the everything all at once, but it needs to be limited, dissociated. That's what what's that philosopher's name? Bernardo Kastrup. That's the word he likes to use, and I like that because it's more fitting when we're talking about consciousness. Dissociation rather than separation or division. And that brings me to the next section, which I'm going to call everything, right? Because we're talking about God as the everything, as the unity. So this idea of God as infinite, undifferentiated potential is actually an echo of this ancient idea of the monad, of the one primordial thing from which all things come. The everything everywhere all at once, so to speak. This is a divine and cosmic unity. It, by definition, contains all things. All things, however, include realities that cannot be accounted for by the physical reductionist paradigm of science. Reality is polar. So there's two components to it. Opposites, right? The Ouroboros. Haisch says, reality involves both tangible physical matter and an immaterial something. This immaterial something is intimately involved in the existence of consciousness and life, right? This is the idea of spirit or soul, the numinous, the thing that can't be captured by science, can't be quantified or measured. Life, consciousness, mind, that sort of thing. And the reductionist assumption is something like this. Science cannot tell us anything about any possible non-physical realities. Since non-physical realities cannot be investigated by science, they do not exist. This is the argument of modern science. This is why there's no exploration into things like God, like spirit, like consciousness. He goes on, he says, Descartes wrote, "I think, therefore I am." I contend that even when I succeed in suppressing all thought, the background hum of consciousness drones on. Right? So Haisch is parting from Descartes here and saying, I am, even when I'm not thinking, because there's this potential for thought, this background hum of consciousness there all the time, this primordial, fundamental, irreducible awareness. He says, consciousness itself is therefore the fundamental experience. Wow, just like God, right? Fundamental. He says, it simply is. Consciousness simply is. Just like he said earlier, God simply is. Here he's saying, consciousness simply is. He said, I therefore regard it as utterly fundamental. Knowledge of consciousness is root knowledge, as inalienable to my being as water is to the ocean. And yet modern Western science denies that consciousness can be anything but a byproduct of neurology and biochemistry in the brain. All right, so I'll paraphrase for you a chunk of the book next where he really talks about near-death experiences, mystical experiences, and then cases of brain damage. And the whole point of this is to describe how consciousness cannot possibly be generated by the brain. Obviously, the brain's important in the expression of consciousness, but it cannot possibly be generated by the brain. And so what he means here is when you have people who report near-death experiences after brain death, how is it you're having an experience when your brain has no electrical activity or chemical activity? There's nothing on that little monitor, but you're coming back to life and saying you had this whole experience. You saw your dead relatives, you saw the world of light, whatever. You come back and you tell us that story. Well, if that's the case, you were having conscious experiences whilst your brain was dead. How could it be that consciousness comes from the brain? And he makes the same argument about these people that have traumatic brain injuries. There's several cases, notable famous cases, of people that have brain damage. And rather than being retarded in their cognition as a consequence of that, they become savants, right? These people will have their, serious brain damage, and now they can speak a new language, or now they're like a fantastic artist, or they can play the piano, right? So how can brain damage enhance consciousness? Right? If it's coming from the brain, you would think that's impossible. So this is just a strong counter arguments that are, what's the word for that? These are just, people's individual experiences. This is not hard science, but in his mind, enough to just dismiss out of hand that the brain is generating consciousness. And if that's true, and consciousness is beyond the brain, it's something weirder than you think. Weirder than science can grapple with. He says, in the God theory, consciousness is the primary stuff of reality. Consciousness is able to shape and direct matter. Consciousness, in fact, has created the universe. So here you can see again that conflation coming to light between consciousness and God. He says, consciousness has created the universe. God has created the universe. You see that. That brings me to the next section, and this is really the meat and potatoes of the book. I'm going to call this section the 0-point field, the light of the world. So I have a scientific title and then a religious title. The 0-point field and the light of the world. The 0-point field is electromagnetic radiation. It is light, right? So that's what we mean. And Haisch begins like this. There's a rule in quantum physics that states no quantum object can ever be brought completely to rest. This is the idea of Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. He says they will always possess a residual random jiggle, thanks to quantum fluctuations. These are those quantum fluctuations in the vacuum that we were talking about earlier, the quantum vacuum. He says this principle applies to all electromagnetic waves. Right, light is part of that electromagnetic spectrum. So think about light. This idea of never being able to come completely to rest and always having these residual energy. He calls them jiggles, but residual energy and motion and things like that. These are those particles popping in and out of existence in the vacuum, that kind of thing. And again, he said this applies to all electromagnetic waves, and he goes on. He says, at every possible frequency, there will always be a tiny bit of electromagnetic jiggling going on. And if you add up all the ceaseless fluctuations, you get a background sea of light whose total energy is enormous. Right? So you have this very, very small, slight, in very much in the background activity that seems marginal to all the physical things that are happening in the cosmos. And he's saying, but if you add up all those slight little things, what you find is it is a enormous sea of light. All right. And the energy of that light is enormous. He says this is the electromagnetic zero-point field. He says if you create a quantum vacuum, and what you are left with is the zero-point field full of zero-point energy, the vacuum as an absolute void does not exist. Rather, the zero-point field is a state of both paradox and possibility, a seething sea of particle pairs, energy fluctuations, and force perturbations popping in and out of existence. He says the fact that the zero-point field is the lowest energy state makes it unobservable. It's invisible to us. He says, since it is everywhere, inside and outside of us, permeating every atom in our bodies, we are effectively blind to its presence. And then he says, God said, let there be light, and there was light. Right? He says the simple statement from Genesis has for 3 millennia revealed an insight into the mysterious nature of our material world. It portrays light as the first manifestation of creation. All right, so this is all going to start adding up here, but it's going to maybe seem a little disjointed because I'm going to give you a little paraphrase because it's just more concise. He starts talking about something called the Casimir force. I don't know if anyone's ever heard of the Casimir force, but it is a physical force that is caused by electromagnetism. So it's not gravity, it's not a physical force. It's caused by electromagnetism. And the way it works is that this experiment that's involved with this is taking these metal plates and putting them very, very, very close together and measuring this force, this attracting force between them. Once you get these plates close enough together, they pull together like a magnet. So there's a force happening there. And it turns out that when there's less electromagnetic radiation between the object than outside of that object, the force is greater on the outside, it pushes them together. And so this is the Casimir force. This causes the electromagnetism or light to push harder from the outside, so it seems like an attractive force. Okay, then he pivots to this scientist, the work of this guy named Alfonso Rueda, who proposed that the origins of this force, this Casimir force, is the zero-point field. Now, he proved an equivalent mechanism to what scientists since Newton call inertia and have attributed to mass, to an object's mass. He came up with a whole other explanation for this, that it's actually the zero-point field doing this, not the mass of the object, the zero-point field. And the implication is that light as this zero-point field, is responsible not only for the formation of matter, but also in shaping and forming the cosmos as a whole. So you might see the zero-point field as the architect of the cosmos. And he says, this suggests that the solid, stable world of matter is sustained at every instant by this underlying sea of quantum light. If some underlying realm of light is the fundamental reality propping up our physical universe, how does the universe of space and time appear from the perspective of light? How would things look if you were moving at the speed of light? The laws of relativity are clear on this. If you could move at the speed of light, you would see all space shrink to a single point, and all of time collapse to an instant. In the reference frame of light, there is no space and time. To say that the ordinary world of matter is propped up by a form of light that itself experiences neither space or time may sound mystical. Yet our research suggests that this is a valid, quantifiable statement of physics. And I want to point out here when he talks about the reference frame of light, what it would be like if we could travel at the speed of light. He says that the reference frame of light collapses space and time. There is no space and time. And I just want to point out, this is exactly what is said of God. Haisch said it earlier. God is outside of space and time because he created space and time. So you have this weird equivalency between the frame of the reference frame of light and the reference frame of God. All right. He says, my point is that special relativity theory exchanges the cart and the horse of classical physics. Instead of an absolute space and time filled with an ether that sustains the epiphenomenon of light, light becomes the fundamental thing, whose propagation determines the flow of time and the measure of distance. We can almost say that light creates space-time. I suggest here that light, in the form of a universal electromagnetic zero-point field, also creates and sustains the world of matter that fills space-time. Just as the cosmic microwave background is the faint remnant of the Big Bang, so perhaps the zero-point field is some echo of the divine within the confines of our space-time universe. Isn't that something? He says, esoteric traditions attribute primacy to light rather than matter. Einstein's relativity theory also suggests that space and time are defined by the propagation of light. You see that contrast, esotericism and modern science. He says the smallest quantum bundle of light, called a photon, moves through space and time at a fixed pace of 186,000 miles per second, at least from your material perspective. From its own perspective, however, there is no space or time. Herein lies what I suspect is a profound connection between the basis of space and time and light in the form of the zero-point radiation. I propose that light may be the progenitor of an apparent universe of matter, in some sense slowing down ever so minutely from that privileged, timeless, spaceless reference frame. In other words, space and time are created when you leave the reference frame of light. I argue that light propagation may actually create space and time. The zero-point field inertia hypothesis implies that the most fundamental property of matter, namely mass, is also created by light. Jesus. All right, so there's one thing I want to point out here, and that's when he says, he kind of summarizes this whole paragraph. He says, in other words, space and time are created when you leave the reference frame of light. All right, so we know that from the perspective of light, there is no space and time. It all comes collapsing back into that unity. We already associate that unity with God. And so you might say, when you leave the reference frame of God, that's when you enter the physical world of space and time. And what does that mean, to leave the reference frame of God? It means what he said earlier, creation by separation, by division. When your consciousness is separated from the divine unity, right, then you're leaving the frame of reference of God or of light. And the world that was once a cosmic unity that you were identical to now becomes this multiplicity of space and time and objects and laws and all that. So we have this interesting equivalency between the reference frame of light and the reference frame of God, okay? He says, I argue that creation is not an act in time, but rather a continuous sustaining of a physical universe. From the realm of the absolute, it is more like a continuous, eternal, yet atemporal process. God did not set the universe going and then step aside. God supports and sustains the universe in every moment in an ongoing act of creation. Creation did not happen. It is. Ooh, you hear that? Creation is, just like consciousness is, and God is. He says, moreover, I propose that the continuous flow of light energy in the form of the zero-point field may be the mechanism for this ongoing creation. So creation is this process, this eternal process between the infinite and the finite, between the potential and the actual, between God and being. And all of that is consciousness, right? God and being, all of that is one thing. It's this consciousness that we keep talking about. Light is part of it. Life is part of it. Consciousness is part of it. All right, he says, when he said God supports and sustains the universe in every moment in an ongoing act of creation, and he talks about this light, this zero-point field light being the mechanism for this continual process. It reminds me of things like from mythology. It reminds me of this idea of the sun. Let's say that the ancient Egyptians worshipped as the eye of Horus, right? So you have light that is coming from the sun, but it's associated with this Christian idea that God, or maybe even Santa Claus, knows what you've been thinking, knows when you're asleep and awake, right? When God knows what's in your heart, God knows everything. That's the eye of Horus. That's the all-seeing eye, and that's associated with the sun. So here you also have the sun and consciousness, light and consciousness associated with each other in the same way Haisch is describing. But just going back to, again, the esoteric tradition, this ancient pagan idea of the eye of Horus. And this idea of this ongoing creation, this perpetual process. He said God didn't just let there be light and the world was created once and then he stepped away. It's like God is involved continually in this and sustaining the cosmos. The Hindus believe God is Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva, the creator, the preserver, and the destroyer. But those three gods are one, right, in Hinduism. And this is something like what he's saying. He's talking about the Vishnu. He's talking about the preserver. What preserves this thing that we call being or reality? What keeps it going? It's like this could be the zero-point field. This could be the mechanism for that. And I have to say, in quantum physics, this idea of the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum physics is this idea of consciousness collapsing the wave function. So you have this wave function that's a mathematical description of probability, which says that a quantum particle could be here or it could be there. We don't have any way of knowing exactly where it is. I can only tell you that it might be here and there. And the reason for that is that what reality is behind the scenes are these fields, these quantum fields, right? So that's why you have this uncertainty involved with trying to describe that field as a specific point in time, like a specific thing. It doesn't quite work that way. The quantum world is not a specific thing; it's this amorphous thing. And so this idea of a ongoing creation, it sounds like there is a perpetual wave function collapse, like consciousness in all of its forms are continuously observing God and collapsing that infinite potential that he is into the cosmos, that it's a recurring and an eternal process. And that's going to remind you maybe of people like Alfred North Whitehead that talk about process metaphysics, or even Phasian, who talked very much about this idea of a process, that God is a process. All right, so before we wrap up here, Haisch also talks about the work of another scientist named Dan Cole from Boston University, who showed that the zero-point field could actually be the source of energy that prevents electrons from crashing into the nucleus of an atom. Like they're losing energy, but why do they never come collapsing in? Like why does the nucleus not drag those things down, like the moon getting dragged down to the Earth through gravity? Like why doesn't that happen? And Dan Cole's saying, well, there's this energy, this constant inflow of energy that's sustaining these electrons from keeping the energy high enough to sustain them. So you have this something that provides stability, atomic stability, that allows atoms to be atoms. And he says that energy comes from the zero-point field. He also says there may be a spiritual substance to science, as well as a scientific substance to spirit, with light as the key link. And that brings me to my conclusion. I love the way Haisch bounces back and forth between scientific knowledge and scientific descriptions to these parallel ideas from ancient esotericism. It's like speaking two languages so fluently that you recognize the patterns underlying them both. I also love that we cannot write his ideas off as naive, since he's far from an amateur and in fact holds unimpeachable scientific credentials. In both the esoteric and scientific models of reality, we begin from a singularity. Both sides agree to this. While one side prefers the label Big Bang and the other God or monad, whatever you wish to call it, it was something. And that something was a cosmic unity, containing within it the potential for all things, both physical and non-physical. This thing we can call fundamental because without it, there can be no existence. Interestingly, there are three things that Haisch describes as fundamental, which blurs the lines between them. The three things which Haisch says simply is are God, consciousness, and creation. So at least in his mind, there is no distinction between them. They are one, as the mystics say. God is inseparable from creation and from consciousness, which fills creation with life and knowing. I couldn't agree more. Where the esoteric rubber meets the road, however, is this idea of light, or the zero-point electromagnetic field. As you may know, the idea of light is often central in religious symbolism as well as in mysticism. We can point to Jesus being called the light of the world, or the earlier Gnostic groups who referred to themselves as we who come from the light. Stranger still, we could point to Emanuel Swedenborg, who claimed that stars are portals. They're holes in the fabric of physical reality, which convert the love of God from divine substance to physical light. But this is a far stretch from a scientific description of the zero-point field, isn't it? Well, let's look more closely. Haisch told us that the zero-point field cannot be removed from the physical cosmos. It is also unobservable, since it exists uniformly everywhere. It determines the flow of time and creates and sustains the world of matter by creating mass and providing the energy for atomic stability. So what does this all mean? If the zero-point field cannot be removed from space-time, then it must be fundamental to space-time, as we believe God to be. It is unobservable, making it invisible and intangible, as we believe God to be. It creates and sustains the world of matter, as we believe God to do. Am I starting to convince you? But wait, there's more. Haisch also describes physics from the perspective of light. This is strange in itself, as it seems to imply that light has a perspective and therefore is a subject, as we believe God is. But most critically, the perspective of light is uniquely unlike anything else, without exception, outside of space and time, just as God is believed to be. I suppose I'll close by repeating Haisch's suggestion. Quote, there may be a spiritual substance to science, as well as a scientific substance to spirit, with light as the key link.
Well, there you have it. That's one avenue explored, but infinitely more still to go. I hope you enjoyed thinking along with us. I know. It's not easy work. Thinking. It's hard and full of uncertainties, but I'm grateful for the company as we trek through this together. Here's to hoping that the juice is worth the squeeze. See what I did there? Let's find out together in the next episode.